This sounds like a press release, but when I was 7 years old, the World Book Encyclopedia fell open to puppets because I was bothering my mother and she said, "Go while I make lunch, look at the books." So I sat cross-legged on the floor, grabbed a random volume, it was P, and it fell open to puppets. And you know, I looked at that, there was a picture of this man, Bill Baird, and his wife surrounded by puppets, and I read some of the article, and my mother called me for lunch, and I closed the book and said, well, that's what I'll do for the rest of my life. And so the family joke has been, for years, why didn't it fall open to plumber, or pediatrician, or podiatrist? But no, it fell open to puppetry. And that's actually how it started. That was the initial fascination. My first puppet was from the World Book Encyclopedia, where they had a little illustration of how to make a marionette. And it was dowel. And I didn't know what dowel was. I was 7, for heaven's sakes, but it was all jointed with screw eyes. So I grabbed the broom and went into the basement, grabbed a saw, sawed the broom apart, managed to get a few screw eyes in, and went upstairs to say, look, I'm making a puppet. Got the biggest spanking of my life for cutting up the broom and working a saw at the age of 7. So yeah, that was my first puppet. Early influences were, I think, things on TV, of course, but one of the biggest obsessions I had was a man named Bill Baird, who was that man in the World Book Encyclopedia. And coincidentally, at the same time, The Sound of Music came out, and he had done the puppets for the Lonely Goat Herd sequence in The Sound of Music. And so I became a Bill Baird freak and started writing him letters, because I managed to get his address out of some Scholastic magazine or something that had done a profile on him. They said his charming theater at 59 Barrow Street in New York City. So I started writing him letters. I wrote him when I was 7. I wrote him when I was 10, telling him I could leave my family and move to New York and work for him. I wrote him when I was 14. I was getting a little annoyed with him. He wasn't replying, and said, look, I can seriously leave my family and come to New York and work for you. And when I was in theater school, I hated it so much I wrote Bill Baird another letter in frustration saying, you have to save me and get me out of here. So I quit university and I went to an international puppet congress in Moscow and got a job, saved my money, went to Moscow, and he was there. And he said, I didn't know how to get in touch with you. So are you stopping in New York? I said, yeah. And he said, good, come audition. And on my 19th birthday, I auditioned for Bill Baird, and he hired me, and I worked at his permanent puppet theater in New York City. So my obsession turned into a thing. But there was a television show called High Diddle Day, and a woman named Noreen Young, who made these amazing latex rubber puppets. I wrote her a fan letter, and she wrote me back. And so anybody who wrote me back was stuck with me for life. And so I was 10 when I wrote that. I'm 66 right now, and I still know Noreen Young. She has a birthday tomorrow, actually, and she's one of my dearest friends. So I wrote a lot of fan letters to puppeteers, and anyone who wrote back, I figured, was family for life, and some of them were. What's my biggest challenge? I think, like any artist, it's money. You know, I tell all my assistants and apprentices who come through my studio, there hasn't been a day in my adult life I don't worry about money. And that's because I'm a small theater company, I'm a producer, and you know, and I have to pay the mortgage and buy groceries and build the shows. So I think that would be my challenge, because I'm not bereft of ideas or collaborators or inspiration. That's everywhere. So like most people, I think it's just making a go of it, really. The most surprising thing I've learned in puppetry is how these characters, these little wooden and paper mache vessels, can speak so much to human beings. And when they're performed properly in the right context, I have always been amazed at how people will attach their own frame of reference and their own emotional lives to those characters. So I make them and I manipulate them and I write them and I voice them, but I think the real soul filling happens when the audience puts themselves into that character's story. And that sounds very woo-woo, but it's actually a true thing that happens in the theater. So that's the most amazing thing that I've learned as a puppeteer. And I guess if I had advice for a young artist, a young puppeteer, it's always tell your stories, you know. They don't have to be autobiographical, but tell stories that interest you, because we're pretty universal. And the frame of audience that the audience brings in everywhere in the world is pretty much the same. We all know desire and jealousy and fear and longing. So if you can tap into any of those emotions in the audience, whether you're a visual artist or a performing artist, then you've got a story worth telling. My studio is affectionately known as Puppetland. It's a storefront. It was a diner at one point. It's got high ceilings with the original pressed tin and a terrazzo floor. It has shelves on both sides running straight up 12 feet. I have 1,600 books on puppetry alone in there, and then fashion books and art books. It's a great resource place, big work tables. It has 4 chandeliers in it, just because I thought that would be funny. We work under fluorescent light usually. But it's a room that I feel comfortable in all by myself in the middle of the night, or 5 or 6 of us can work in on a deadline, and it's very pleasant. So I've always wanted my studios to feel welcoming and comfortable, because I basically live in them. And this one's a humdinger. I love Puppetland a lot. I have so many next projects. I'm thinking of this really silly idea called Stage Fright, which is a troupe of actors in an abandoned theater, and we find out that they are all dead, and they all died at different times on stage through horrible and hilarious circumstances. When did I realize I could be successful at this? Successful is a funny word, but I think when I started touring around the age of 14, I didn't have a driver's license, so my dad would have to take time off work and load up the family car with my stage and my show and drive me to my lucrative gigs, $50 or $75. But I think around the age of 16, my dad kind of clued into the fact that I was making money doing this, and I realized I was a showman. This is what I was going to do. So it just solidified in my brain that this was going to be my career, come hell or high water. My style and technique have changed. I'm always refining the building process, and I think lately my style has changed in terms of I don't build puppets like a lot of other people. You know, in puppetry they have to have big heads and be very stylized, and more, because I tell human stories, I'm interested in different proportions. I started out in cartoon proportions, and then, as Bill Baird did, then I moved more into a naturalistic proportion and a stylized naturalism, but now I'm actually exploring heroic proportions where the heads are very small on the puppets, because for me a marionette is all having the whole body. So I'm interested in designing a figure that's the whole body. But also I've started incorporating hand puppets again, like I did when I was first starting out, hand puppet shows, and I'm madly in love with just simple puppets on my hand as storytelling vehicles. I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to retire. My stage manager, Crystal, just wants me to keep working until I die on stage. I think that's what she would like to see, and that sounds pretty good to me too.
Absolutely. He's going to just fall over on stage one day, and that'll be the end.
The only social media I'm on is Instagram, so at Ronnie Burkett on Instagram. And I think I have a link to my agent there if they want to book us.